Hi, and welcome to week two, shifting into week three. At this point, all of you should have engaged the resources, the short discussion posting, the podcast on Mark Twain, and of course the readings, um, the passing of grandson, Dunbar's poetry, and of course Henry James. For the most part, everyone is doing a great job of posting and responding back. There are a few areas that I'm going to want to mention as far as building that, but I think you're starting to see how the class functions, and I'm really enjoying seeing the level of work that you're all doing. It's truly amazing, and I really am enjoying the discussions that you are all having. Now, today's discussion, of course, builds on realism and local color realism, which is what we were doing from last week. So you're already kind of becoming more comfortable with those elements. Now, most of you, really did focus on this notion of the Civil War, this kind of cleaving of the country into two components, wars against self and other and brother. So I do think that most of you did capture that. There was also, in many senses, this local color realism, which we fed in on. It also kind of had this sense of kind of capturing the now, and kind of putting you into that place, which is exactly what realism's real goal was to kind of resemble life in a very accurate representation. And then as we move into week three, we're going to really get into naturalism, which is really going to deal with that determinism, kind of that almost pessimistic viewpoint of the world. Now, a lot of you did make mention in your postings of the levels of realism and what you found to be more engaging or that drew you in with this accurate representation of life. So I do want to spend some time going through those. For instance, I think that Brittany, well, actually, we'll start off with the ones that I've reviewed. We'll kind of go backwards. Now, John was the last post that I reviewed, and John really did enjoy Dunbar's poetry, especially the We Wear the Mask, this idea that it captured the experience in a metaphor, but yet still realistically captured this sense of who Dunbar was and what it meant to go through this experience of being black, of wearing this mask in many ways, an emblem of the experience of this, I guess you'd say, this population, this generation, and really capturing it well. Now, I know that many of you wrote about Dunbar, and I really appreciate that hint of Dunbar that kept popping up in your work. Now, I do think the other thing that John mentioned was also James mentioned the idea of, who was actually the last post, in an attached document. Please try not to attach those things. It's really hard to open them up, and you don't get as much traffic and discussion when you do that. So please cut and paste them in. But I like that you focus on the spider web, that metaphor that James used. And I saw that a lot of you were wrestling with this idea of how can we present something realistically, like it's capturing real life, but at the same time it's operating on another level in the symbolic or metaphoric quality. Tuan mentioned and had a really good summary of the passing of grandson by Chestnut. But remember, you don't just want to tell us what the story says. You really do want to do some analysis. Remember, main idea, what you think about the work, and the evidence that supports your thoughts, and then that analysis is key too. Chestnut is not just another local colorist. I mean, I think a lot of the times local color becomes a way to put people into a box, and Chestnut really isn't that. He is, of course, an African-American writer who's working in the mode and fashion that was pioneered during this time, which is realism. But he is very complex. He has a breadth and depth of achievement that is amazing, even without thinking about who he is. Chestnut is a paradox. He's a black writer. He is of mixed race. He narrates black experience in such a way that it almost seems that there's there's, of course, a reference back to the other narratives of Black experience and slave narratives, but there's also a hint of this kind of almost whitewashed quality. He really thinks about how the changed perceptions of the African Americans in the United States have changed over the past 33 years as he was writing of the history of the United States. He thinks about the identities. He is a realist in his conviction, but he also thinks about this idea of the real. Like, what is the real? He also speaks in a chorus of voices. He violates your expectations many times, and a lot of you mentioned that. And then, of course, he really thinks about plot in a different way, much more different presentation than what we would see in other areas. He likes a safe distance, but then he violates that and pulls you right in. He socially removes himself from the story he tells, but he then comes in to this notion that American reality is conventional, that it's white, that it's turn of the century, and then he's twisted again. He uses folk tales. He uses all these ideas that are really in tension. And many of you mentioned that. Kristen, one of my my little teacher heart goes pitter-patter every time I look at one of Kristen's interchanges, because I think you're really engaging the literature, and I really enjoy seeing that. You're not the only one, but you're one of the stars in many ways of engaging this literature and thinking about how it can function. Sharon really mentioned this idea that realism in all these works deals with real issues, and that dealing with real issues is key. Like, how does Chestnut deal with the real issues? And the real issues of the time, this tension between identity, this tension between rights and civil rights, which wasn't even part of the public conversation yet, but is still so ingrained in that experience, is really the wrestling part in many of these works. Chandra mentioned that the compelling twist, which once we go back to Chestnut's idea of unfamiliarity that he tries to play with the reader, Chandra did mention that this was her favorite read and that it was that twist at the end. Curtis, I like that you mentioned that When My Lady Sings, and that you laughed out loud because the almost realistic, that's still translated across time, perspective of this woman singing, which I'm glad to hear that it reached you in that way. Jennifer pulled in Harris, which is we've not talked a lot about Harris, this idea of kind of passing, this idea of exploring and presenting, and Harris really does try to capture this memory of life in the Old South that is a little more idealized, a little more distant, almost kind of a hazy way of looking at it, of peaceful race relations. But, it's really, yes, it is kind of, it was really dismissed many times because it's seen as him pandering, but he's really not. He really is thinking about how to capture race and imagination, which is a key element that I think often is overlooked, and I really like that Jennifer mentioned Harris and kind of pulling that in. Curtis pulled up this idea, along with Ryan, of passing, that this, and Ryan really captured it, that the passing of grandson by Chestnut really does deal with family and slavery and love, and the reality of those three and how they intersect and engage. Clyde, much like James mentioned, the art of fiction, that you like that metaphor of the spider web, that it kind of pulls and captures. And that is a nice way to think about this presentation of information, is that it is captured and engaged. Katie mentioned that she originally thought the story was about someone dying, the story from Chestnut, and then as she read it, she realized that it wasn't that someone was dying, but that slave life, that this metaphor was dying, which is a good way an interesting way to look at it, because passing in many ways does reference this idea of being a different identity, or of being able to perform a different place or a different space. Deanna mentioned that did a lot of work on this notion of African American, the tension between some being free, some not being free, those levels of freedom, and how do you pass between those levels, which was good in comparison with Chestnut's story. Ryan once again went back to Harris and mentioned this enjoyment he felt with it, that this realistic portrayal of life really did kind of capture a sense of the time and the space. Shannon focused on Dunbar's dialect, which was good because she also mentioned the idea of Henry James, defining mainstream realism, and this kind of dialect being kind of combined with it. There was a great exchange between Troy and Christian about Dunbar, and Troy, of course, another one of the very engaged posters. I highly recommend that you take a look at these postings. If we were in a classroom, these would be the moments where we were really getting excited about the reading. That Troy mentioned that this kind of idea of passing as a metaphor for Chestnut. Also, the idea of a will to freedom and the desire of equality kind of being the underlying themes, which of course connects greatly to what was just happening post-Civil War and the antebellum time, that there is this tension about what is freedom, who gets freedom, and you're really going to see this in Washington and Du Bois when we read the next week's reading, this tension between the talented 10th versus, the idea of access to trade and other vocational training. Priscilla, great post on Dunbar, this idea of make sure you are, kind of presenting this overview. Make sure you're citing Priscilla and others. If you're pulling in information from other sources, make sure that you're using MLA to cite within your sources and within your postings. Kayla, great summation. I love that you and Ryan in your debate are exploring the passing of grandson. This exploration and your kind of exchange back and forth is really what this class is about. It isn't just about sitting in your own room, in your own space, and reading the book and passively accepting the information. It's about talking about it. It's about getting it off the page. Kristen and Brittany, you guys started off our discussion this week with Brittany talking about Dunbar with an excellent overview, talking about these ideas, two distinct voicism, this kind of racism, this kind of modern-looking voice, and then Kristen kind of picking up on Chestnut's idea of realism, historical fact, passing these layers of meaning. So I think that overall, that what we found in this week's discussion is a keen focus on the realistic portrayal of one's experience of their life, but how that also connects and interconnects throughout history and connects throughout the readership. I look forward to seeing how you take naturalism and some of these readings that are dealing with similar themes of family, of survival, of identity, of race, and how it treats it from a deterministic perspective, like you can't get out of it. Like, at least in realism, there's a sense of hope. In naturalism, there's going to be much more sense of pessimism, and I look forward to kind of seeing how you deal with that. If you do have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to contact me. Thanks, and have a great day.